The benefit of a slightly smaller venue is you can feel like we're all part of this, not just on receive. I'm really delighted that we're doing this panel right at the beginning of the day, and I think, you know, the conversation with Lord Moylan is fascinating to me because it sets up breaking out of our bubble. There's a lot of people in the room that would agree that there is a systemic failure in housing, that we need to be more strategic about an industrial strategy, we need to be more strategic around how we really invest and understand how we invest as housing and social infrastructure, partly, as we're getting into, because of the health benefits. And yet there is also a consensus that would say it's a market, leave it to the market. And so actually what Lord Moylan has done brilliantly has just reminded us that we can't just assume that everybody agrees. And that's really important. You know, it's really important that we see there is an uphill battle about how we reframe and restate the importance of investment as housing and social infrastructure for wider benefit. So actually, Zoe, I think this has set us up brilliantly for this panel. I'm going to hand over to you. Please, though, we're going to have time for Q&A, so be ready. Think that this is about our engagement together. We don't want this to just be come and receive and leave. We want this to be about our shared collaboration engagement. Zoe.
And Jez, will someone sort of keep an eye on time for me, like wave at me to say we need to be quiet and go to the floor for questions? That's great. I'm delighted to be here, and it's this topic is something of real passion. I've been working in this sector probably for 16 years now and working alongside Jez for probably 10. For myself, I'm an architect by training, but you wouldn't want me to put pen to paper anymore. But what I am an expert is on resilience. So the point that Daniel was making earlier around what problem are we solving is an area that I am really fundamentally passionate about. And my own personal view is that we have completely decoupled the role that housing plays as a foundation to this nation's society to function in a resilience way, and it's absolutely a cornerstone to enabling us to be productive and grow as a nation. My own experience is that what we didn't understand, and partly what Daniel was kind of articulating, we didn't understand that we needed government, local government, to transform how it was evaluating and operating to enable contractors in the supply chain to interact and to generate the scale and pace of housing for delivery. I'm briefly going to introduce my fabulous panel, which I love the fact that we've got a GP and a founder of a fantastic health business. We've got Graham, who's a Category 2 MMC developer. Yeah, Category 2. And Matthew from a charity who is actively undertaking credible research and influencing policy significantly. So, William, I'll let you introduce yourself briefly and move down.
Yeah, so hi, as Zoe said, I'm William Bird, I'm a GP, but I've also been working very much in prevention, basing on communities and how communities can actually produce health, on that health creation. So I've set up Intelligent Health, which is a company which actually we've got 2 million people engaged in what we call a game, actually it's called Beat the Street. But through that game, we actually managed to get the health of all of those people and understand a lot more about what they feel about their neighbourhood, the area around them, and where health really sits, which of course we know is not the NHS, it's actually in community and prevention.
And William, just briefly, we were chatting just before, right outside the mock-up room, and you said, you described to me as a GP what that represented for you, that room upstairs. Have you all seen it?
Yeah, I mean...
Sorry, this is
in the main exhibition.
Yeah.
Absolutely, with all the damp around. So I worked in Reading. I have done the East End of London, but actually in Reading. So Reading's fairly affluent, biggest town in Britain, and you wouldn't expect it to have. But I've been to many, many houses and flats in that, in Reading, in Whitley, in the south of Reading. And there are pockets where that is absolutely the norm. You know, that is not an exception at all. That's completely the norm. That's in a fairly affluent part of southeast England. So working in other areas, you see that is the norm. And so anyone who thinks, oh gosh, isn't that awful? Well, I'm afraid that is absolutely normal for most people who live in those deprived areas.
William.
So good morning, everyone. My name's Graham Corders. I'm the development director for a business called Edaroth, which stands for Everyone Deserves a Roof Over Their Heads. We have a proprietary MMC product that was developed by Atkins Realis, and Edaroth is the development company that basically sells that to our clients as an end-to-end service.
Thanks, Graham. And Matthew.
Hello everyone, my name is Matthew Morgan. I'm the Director of the Quality of Life Foundation. Our aim is to make health and wellbeing central to the way we create and care for our homes and neighbourhoods. We carry out research, we try to implement best practice through consultancy services to evaluate what makes a good home and a good neighbourhood, and then we advocate for change to local and national government and to industry.
Thank you. So I just want to ask a question of all of you in the room and understand whether if any of you have experienced, whether in your childhood or now, the impermanence of not having a good quality home or an unsafe home or insecure home or faced the threat of eviction. Have any of you experienced any of that? Yeah, okay. If I may, I'm going to ask you a question, but I'm going to ask myself it first and answer it, okay? Which is, how did it feel physically and mentally to have that experience? So, for me, my childhood wasn't a very safe space, so I spent a lot of time outdoors in nature, and I was lucky I could do that. Last November, Storm Bert hit my home. Within an hour and a half, I had over a foot of water in my home, and I was rendered, in effect, homeless. Fortunately, my son wasn't there, because that was front and foremost, how could I protect my son from that experience and the trauma it was creating for me, because it was traumatic. Anyway, I moved out. I had friends around that I could go and move in with. I had my belongings all over Wiltshire. But what was always front of my mind was how could I protect my son so that he didn't see the trauma that was causing me. I'm lucky, I'm financially independent, I have a good job, I have a business that was compassionate and supportive, but it was protecting my son. What did that feel like for me? I was physically wired, I couldn't sleep, I was barely able to function doing my job. Thankfully, I moved into a house last Friday, I'm out of it. I only sustained that experience for 8 weeks. So I just wanted to highlight this has got a human cost, and I think we forget that. And almost Daniel's point when he talked about social rent housing, well, he was talking about very privileged people when he was, talking about, as an example, we need diversity of voices in terms of how we think about housing. Would one of you mind offering how your experience felt for you, physically and mentally?
Yeah, so I could probably still live in it, to be honest. So, hi. So I was a young mum, but I've always worked. So I've never really been on benefits, but I came into a situation that I got divorced. My house got repossessed. So this is when I was on the South Coast, and very quickly found myself in a homeless situation with 2 children under 2 at 21. But I was working every day. I was working in schools, helping children. So for me, that experience, and then I'll go to a more recent one, that experience was hideous for me because I not only was dealing with a divorce, not only was I young and lacked support, I was very lucky with a family, but I'd left home early because of family situations. So going back for me was mentally not the option, going back home to my family home. I didn't have money for food, so whilst my children were in childcare, I massively advocate for childcare, why I do the work I do. I could take my children to a safe space. I knew they were getting fed at nursery every day, whilst I sat down in a council office. I think on the 3rd attempt nearly got arrested because I totally lost the plot. Totally lost it, and it was because I was so overwhelmed. My body was consumed. I ended up being in hospital at 22 with a really bad illness, and it was solely because everything that I knew had been shifted from beneath me, and I was a working mum, and I just needed a house. I just needed a house, and it got taken. And more recently, just to share, I am still in social housing. So I moved to London. I've done a house swap and really advocate for that opportunity. But I've worked my whole career. I have a very good job. I still can't afford a family home in London. So living in social housing where I have damp, I have things that are damaged in my property that have been for 2 years. I still, even Friday, was dealing with a leak that's been unresolved. And I would say I'm a professional like you and I. I've been a consultant for years. I've worked with chief executives of local authorities, and yet I live in that condition. So I think there are many of us in this room, and for me, I want to advocate for the people that don't have a voice, because I think if anyone said to me what's the most important thing is safety, and my children feeling safe, and they didn't feel safe, and I didn't feel safe, and my eldest daughter's now got significant mental health traumas at 22, and that was because I couldn't keep her safe, because mentally I wasn't well myself.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really appreciate your courage in sharing that to the room, but I think this is fundamentally important. And I'm just going to ask William to build on why this really matters, because this need to account for the human cost and therefore the social costs of our failure to really tackle what is a housing crisis needs to be accounted for. And William, I just wonder if you can build really on what you've touched on there. It's Kirsty. What Kirsty's touched on there really around the long-term effects, and the legacy from your perspective.
Yeah, and thanks, Kirsty, because that really does help. And I think you said it really, that one thing we have to do is feel safe, and our brains are designed. So I'm going to do a little bit of science, because I think you have to have some of this science to understand why housing is so important for the long-term effect. So our brains are wired to keep us safe, and survival is the number one thing. Nothing else matters. So if you don't feel safe, the brain is wired to therefore go into fight and flight, as we know, and that changes absolutely everything in the body, including the immune system, which starts to fight against our own bodies because it gets wired. So the immune system starts to cause things like allergies and problems like diabetes type 1, but it also makes people more obese, and all these other things start to come in purely because the brain has rewired itself for survival to hold on to calories and things like that. But as time goes on, they're the ends of the chromosomes called telomeres, and telomeres actually to decide how long we're going to live and what diseases we're going to get in the future. So children who've lived in very poor, damp housing and who've lived in housing here will grow up and have shorter telomeres than those who've had a good upbringing in a neighbourhood, purely on that factor. So we look at the problem in the immediacy, saying it's awful, people have got asthma, people have got depression because of poor housing, but it doesn't matter because they'll all get better once you change. No, you don't. That does stay with you forever. And yes, we can improve things by having a better life later on, but the kind of legacy from that, and I think you call it the long shadow, is absolutely right. The long shadow will continue, and one can do it. It's because the brain is wired. So we have an entire population of this country who are living in this area where their brains have been shaped because of the upbringing they've had, and that causes, and you mentioned earlier on about the 42 billion, the adverse childhood events which do that. 50% of all violence is because of that childhood problem. Drug addiction is because of that problem. 10% of all cancers is caused by those adverse childhood events. I can go on and on about this long shadow. So we look at housing as a kind of, certainly the discussion that came in at the end, as, okay, this is okay, it's all about the markets dealing with it. But we could say that about smoking, let the markets sort out smoking. We had to make an intervention. We had to do something. And why we're not understanding why housing is way worse than smoking in its impact on society, because you think of the number of people affected, and of course obesity as well, that it does. So ultra-processed foods, let the market sort it all out. We can't carry on doing it. But housing is the other part there. So we've got the legacy coming through, and that started, we see that going through to people in their 30s and 40s who've had those problems in the past. And I'm afraid we're still seeing it being generated time and time again. So that's why the importance is, and 42 billion a year was actually a conservative estimate. It doesn't take into account the well-being. And Treasury have actually got in the Green Book the wellbeing, which actually measures the cost of people's well-being being reduced, because that's productivity, that's about relationship problems and all of those other things. And that, if you add it onto that, I would dread to think what the number will be, but it will be a very big number.
Yeah, so what I want to do is we've done a great bit about really, for me, saying partly what's the problem, and saying we need to shift the lens on what housing delivers and what problems it's solving. Matthew, if I can come to you, because obviously we are all here because we are actively working on embedding and looking at ways to account for and embed in health equity and wellness into Policy Planning Commission. Would you like to just bring to life some of the work that you've been doing and how you've been looking at that?
We recently worked with the Institute of Health Equity, which is Michael Marmot's bunch, who had not looked at housing specifically as a key social determinant of health. So we work with them, talking to stakeholders, looking at the evidence, and produced a report aimed specifically at investors, developers and operators. So the private sector, because we feel that it's incumbent upon us all to understand the inequalities of health and how they can feed into the lifelong outcomes for people, but also the fact that everyone within the industry can affect change in this area. And there are a whole kind of panoply of processes and ways of working for everyone to first understand what health inequalities are and the effect that they have, which is what obviously Zoe just outlined there, but the fact that everyone can make a difference and in their work can improve inequalities. And it's through a lot of the stuff that we know already. It's about the provision of good housing first of all, the quality, supply and affordability of housing, but it's also looking at the neighbourhood level, at green space, at connections between neighbours and the ability to get on a bus and be able to get to work. So it's something that can feed into both housing and neighbourhoods, and it's something that we then seek to help the private sector evaluate. So we carry out a lot of post-occupancy evaluations, which look to talk to people and find out what it is that they like about their area and what they don't like about their area, so that we can feed that thinking into the development life cycle and then to hopefully improve the way that places are delivered going forward.
Thanks, Matthew. Now, I like grand designs. I used to enjoy watching grand designs, but I have to say something that I've witnessed and I found really frustrating is when we're trying to deliver social rent housing with our planning colleagues in local council, that again, we find them looking through a lens of grand design. Can you splay a corner off here? Can you tweak this there? Not understanding the system of MMC, but actually more fundamentally not understanding the role of the social housing in their community, their city, their place. Okay, so delivering public good. We've got very good strategic planners. I'm not labelling all planners in that way, but there's something that needs to shift in that mindset for planners. Graham, from Ederoff's perspective, I'm talking about my own experience and relating it to Kevin, but for yourself as Ederoff, what's been the challenge and what do you think needs to shift? What would make bringing what Ederoff does to life faster and at scale?
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. Really good provocative conversation so far this morning, which is really interesting for a change at conferences. So a couple of things I was just sort of thinking as everyone was talking. We talk a lot about the product, and there was various points made about quality of product, market for products. Our product, the Ederoff product, I think is truly a great product. Of course, I would say that, but objectively it is. It meets, but actually it exceeds almost every regulatory criteria that's thrown at housing, and we all know how many are, right? It's one of the most heavily regulated industries, I believe, in the country. So is the problem the product? Because that was the contention, wasn't it? Lord Moylan was sort of insinuating that we hadn't developed good enough products for the market to take up. So I would contend the problem is not the product. We have a great product. I'm sure others of you here also have great products. So what's the problem? The problem is, as Zoe's alluding to, the process, right? It's how we as a country fund, procure and consent housing that is surely the problem. And I think all of us would agree that it sits in a little bit of all of those spaces. Consenting, clearly, in terms of permitting through planning, is a fundamental part of that. We obviously need to get planning in order to deliver homes. There's no debate, we heard, there's no debate politically about the need for homes. So what is the problem? The problem is often, as you rightly say, that local level, it just gets interpreted in so many different ways because ultimately it's grey. The planning system is intentionally grey, it's intentionally vague. So without proper management and without proper political direction at local level, people will make their own interpretations of what they see as the priority. And that has to change. So, you know, there's lots of different ideas about how that could change. I think there's people here with some good ideas on that. We would welcome some kind of, probably a version of a local development order, or effectively a permitted development right for some forms of affordable housing in particular. For me, it seems absolutely crazy that we're asked to go through a full planning process to establish what we already know to be acceptable, which is, you know, do we want to build on brownfield land? Well, yes. Do we want to build net zero in use housing? I thought we probably did. Do we want to build social and affordable housing? Well, most politicians, even conservative ones locally, would agree we probably need some. So I think we all agree on the fundamentals, but somewhere that just gets lost in the process. And I won't bore you with the details, but that's the sort of headline.
The process is too protracted.
The process is too protracted, and it's too subject to individuals' vagaries of interpretation, really.
Yeah, Can I just
Matthew,
make a point on that, just on the local authority context, that we did a piece for the Local Government Association last year that looked at all the mechanisms that they have in place to deliver better health and well-being for their residents, and housing is obviously crucial to that, and planning is crucial to that. But what often happens is that the planners don't necessarily talk to their colleagues in public health, many of whom have the data, many of whom have the knowledge of what their local population is. So what we need to do is to encourage the chief executives in local authorities to bring the planners and the public health teams together, and to think about what the outcomes are that they want for their residents, and base their strategic objectives on those. Because if there was one thing that came out of the report, it's the higher that you can get this thinking into the kind of value chain of decision making. So the higher that you can get into the 2, 3, 4 points that the local authority wants to deliver on, then the better or the more power that those officers further down the chain have to deliver including the social housing that they know is needed and that they know will deliver the better outcomes for those who have the greatest health inequalities.
So, I mean, it really comes into, effectively, we need to have those KPIs baked into the commissioning process and into the business case and act as a golden thread all the way through. And I would say that it doesn't just sit with perhaps those departments coming together. I think it's also where business can play a role. And we know that work we've been doing in Bristol has been looking at that decision tool around helping them navigate those trade-offs and make those decisions. But currently, that's not baked into the system and framing those decisions as they go along on the journey. William, did you want to pick up from your experience, you know, in terms of delivering Beat the Street and generating health equity, some of the ways that you've been accounting for and measuring health, and how you think that might be of relevance in terms of influencing how we commission or influence Treasury in terms of evaluating housing and accounting for the role that housing plays in terms of health creation?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I wanted to just say is that in public health, you know, have always had a kind of well-trodden route. There's always an enemy out there of someone. So it's a drinks enemy, alcohol, it's gambling, they're the enemy. It's fast food outlets, they're the enemy. Smoking, tobacco industry. When it comes to housing, they get a bit confused because they don't quite know who the enemy is. And actually, there is an element of distrust of commercial world. I was at a conference in the public health saying that literally this almost all commercial world are for themselves and shouldn't be trusted. And that was coming out of a big public health conference. So we have to be making sure that trust is built up. There's some public health areas which are really good. I think we need to make sure that language and that trust is really built into it.
I also think there's a challenge to the public health colleagues that they can sometimes be conceived of as the Borg, you know, the very much the this is how it should be done.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing it this way, then you're wrong. And it's not always in the language and tone that will convince others. And because they don't have the levers for that you would have in planning, they're always trying to, you know, chivvy their colleagues along because they know that it's through the local plan or the planning permissions that they can get the or the policy guidance, that they can get the outcomes they want to see. So I think it's a softening and understanding between these different groups and different backgrounds, you know, a GP, a developer, a planner, whoever it is, that I think you can get the better outcomes for all.
Sorry, that was a quick comment. So can I just very quickly, I'll shorten the other bit then. So with Beat Street, one of the things we do, we make a game to be able to get people engaged, and we get the rural deprived communities actually taking part, and we actually get their opinions because we give them points to give them opinions about the place they live in. And what we find is that those deprived areas compared to areas which are more affluent, there is no difference in optimism. There's no difference in the capabilities that the people have got and the wanting to do things. The massive difference, and on the graph you just see this widening, is they hate the place they live in. They don't feel at all safe. They don't feel that they would trust their children to be outside. It's that which seems to be the biggest problem. And there's also a massive lack of trust as well. So trust disappears in the more deprived. But the individuals are all brilliant. And that's what we have to kind of work out. You always feel, you know, and again, in public health, you always feel, oh, people are, you know, we feel sorry. Actually, just give them a right environment, give them a right neighbourhood, make green space available, allow children to be able to play outdoors, and suddenly trust will come back because people will be mixing with each other, they'll be outdoors, and we know that the more people connect with each other, the more trust builds up. And once you've got trust, you've got safety, and once you've got safety, you start to reduce that part of the brain which causes all the problems. So that's how the consequence is, and that's what we've identified. It's about the place and the perceived safety of a place. So you can actually have an area where there's a park and a more deprived area and a more affluent area on the same park. The affluent area will be using a park. Those in the deprived won't be using a park. Sometimes it's about cultural, but usually it's because they just don't feel safe in it. It's exactly the same park. So we've already created, you know, inequalities on that. So that's what I think we're realising, is how important place and neighbourhood is to get people started to feel safe.
So for me, what this really highlights is that the opportunity for the MMC sector and those that are in this place of being able to increase densification of housing where we need homes to enable communities to thrive, really need to play that role in terms of articulating and accounting for the health creation that they are generating. But actually what we really need to see is that on the other side, local government really recognising that those homes are the levers to health creation and wellness and therefore productivity, but we need to actually account for it. And I think what's really been interesting for me on my journey until relatively recently, meeting William a few years ago and reading some of Michael Marmot's work as well, is that actually we know how to account for health and wellness. There's no excuse, but we just need to shift the mindset of Treasury in terms of the business cases and how we commission work. And we need to work with local government to support the shift that needs to happen in terms of how we evaluate developments when they're coming online and on stream. And we know, Jez, we've got partway where with the work with Bristol, where we've proved that the subsidy loss in terms of the cost of temporary accommodation, which is 17 million a year, has been enough to say, all right, yeah, we see that as a loss. It frustrates me because it's like you feel like you're just working with really basic bean counters that will only look at a really simple Excel spreadsheet to say, yeah, right, we get it, we know we need to invest. And yet we actually know the facts in terms of the cost to the health service. We know the cost actually in terms of adult and child social services is huge. I mentioned that 43 billion a year. You know, so we are in the long shadow. We're in it right now, and we need to solve it. So what I would encourage that after this morning, please do talk to Matthew and William, because they do hold some of the answers around accounting for health and bedding it in and baking it into the solution. Graham, you touched on delivery perspective of the homes. The quality is essential. What else would you like to see that would make your life easier in terms of scaling up and delivering in the UK?
Well, I think what you're talking about there in terms of how we account for what we actually deliver is really critical. So again, it was quite interesting to hear the sort of point made where we don't really know whether things are cheaper or more expensive. We don't actually know what the true cost of housing actually is. And I think that is sort of our experience working with clients, because the procurement process and the delivery process for particularly affordable housing is so fragmented that it is actually quite difficult to break down in that process and in that journey where all the true costs sit. And for us as Edaroth, one of our big, so I think one of our USPs really is that we do act as developer for that reason. And so when you appoint us and you work with us in partnership, we're there from the very start, when we just identify the site, through to practical completion and actually beyond, if you so wish. So, and that obviously has a different profile in terms of what we're commissioned to do and the costs that go with that. But that's really clear because it is everything from the start to the end. What we typically find is that because, you know, a lot of affordable housing is procured, particularly sort of D&B contracts or of that ilk, people's mindset is very much focused on that. And so when they're sort of comparing things, they're trying to compare back to a way of buying and a process that's fundamentally different from the one I've just described. So I think, you know, one thing we would ask for is greater understanding and greater clarity of where true costs and value sits in the full process, all the way from concept through to practical completion, but actually beyond into life cycle ownership and management. And that's really important for MMC. I'm sure there are others in the room like us who have incredibly developed models of the product we supply that allows people to leverage that and maintain it in perpetuity properly and efficiently. And that obviously has added value. But we don't really, as it stands, it's very difficult to break that down and have that conversation because the level of understanding and knowledge of the cost and value of each of those bits sits in different places, and bringing it together in one place is really, really hard.
Yeah. Matthew, would you be able to bring to life a little bit of the work that you've been doing with the Better Planning Coalition and how, in terms of the conversations we've been having with investors, what's the mood in the room, like, around health equity and understanding?
I think it's been a fantastic achievement to get health inequalities written into the NPPF. We work with the Better Planning Coalition, who are a group of 36 organisations who focus on health and nature and others. So it's all everyone from the RSPCB to National Trust, whoever. It's part of a whole movement who understand the importance of health, but the challenge is that we are in a political environment where growth is the most important driver, and so... But
surely that should be clearly identified as the link, because how can we support and be productive and growth if our resilience is completely undermined?
That's the long-term answer, but unfortunately, when we're still not into the long-term thinking that will deliver these answers, and so the questions around health and social impact and also community participation, which is a really important part of our work, is something that is seen as a blocker, not a builder often, because you have to fill out a health impact assessment, or you have to talk to people and find out what it is that they want from their neighbourhood. And all of these things take time and can potentially throw up problems. But what we also find, and what we're trying to identify in a kind of sense of a risk register, is the risk that, or the problems that happen if you don't do these things. So particularly for those investors who are taking a longer term approach, if you don't invest in a home or a place that is attractive, well built, safe, and the neighbourhood is a nice place to live, then you're effectively baking in an asset that will lose value over time and won't gain the value that it ultimately could. So we've just done a report for the build-to-rent sector, who are very much interested in this issue. But I think it is that there is a definite challenge at the moment with the agenda and detailing exactly how growth through productivity, through better health and well-being can be delivered, and how important housing is to that.
And I would say that there's a comparable sector. So if I look at transport sector, and we've been trying to work to decarbonise and address inequalities around mobility, when we don't engage with communities, we think we're doing the right thing, you know, in transforming places with active travel, integrating nature. But actually, if we've not engaged with communities, they can create huge resistance. And there you go back to this protracted planning process that costs us time and money. My own view is actually in a time of moving towards more AI and digital, actually we need to be even more purposeful and being deliberate in our democracy. And William, and I value just you picking up on that, because I know you've had some success around that, in Dudley in particular around that. And I think it's relevant to also what we need to be seeing around how we think about housing, around that need for community participation.
Yeah, I mean, some of you might be involved in community participation of what it is. I mean, there's always a token kind of community participation where you bring a community, you know what you're going to do, and there's this distrust already there because people feel actually it is tokenism and are not going to be listened to. So building trust is the first thing, and I've mentioned that about 6 times because I think the lack of trust is one of the big cancers of this society. I think we're really, really struggling. And it's around the world, but actually one of the places, we have lost all our institutions, there's a lack of trust. And if you go to communities, they will not trust the council. In fact, when we do the work, the council say, please don't use our logo on your game because we know it will actually put people off. That's terrible to think that we've got such lack of trust. So the way of building that community engagement is to, first of all, become vulnerable oneself so that you're actually down with those individual people in their communities, where they're working, where they're sitting, where the betting shops, the pubs, the clubs, everywhere. You're getting to know them. You get to know the community leaders, the trusted organisations there, and you build that up. It's not going to be done quickly. You can't do that quickly. And then you work with them all the way through. And I think it's just this fact that we have to, whatever role we've got to be incredibly vulnerable, because that's how any organisation, and big, corporates and commercial, this style of leadership where you become vulnerable and building trust, it's exactly the same as how you build with communities. And then if you do that, you really have the community on board who then begin to own it and own the solution and become proud of it and will look after it and will care for it forevermore. And I think that's how important it is. If you don't get that right, they don't care for it, they don't own it, it will become vandalised or whatever, and you've lost that. And gentrification, there was a big project, 2 seconds, in Belfast, where beautifully done, £10 million from the EU to completely redesign northeast Belfast, and they brought the community in, but the wrong people of the community. They did it really quickly, they had all the tick boxes done, but actually, in the end, a number of people went up using it, but it was all middle-class people coming in, and they took away any of the old heritage of that place, and it made things even worse for that local community. Health actually started going down. So that's the kind of salutary lesson to make.
Yeah. So I'm going to wrap up shortly. I just wanted to add one other thing, is that I think MMC plays a critical role in relation to health as well, in terms of how we make the MMC units themselves, the fact that the factories enable, equity in terms of, gender, etc., and a clean working environment. So I just think that's really important to highlight that as well. As we're closing, what message would you like to give to this room as what we need to do differently from now on with the knowledge and wisdom that you have today? Shall I start? I would say we just need to account for health creation from commissioning business cases right through the process in terms of homes.
And I'd say, I don't want to say the same thing. But,
say it slightly differently, William.
But I think, let's look at smoking, let's look at ultra-processed food, let's look at gambling, let's look at alcohol, let's look at poor housing. All of those others have got restrictions of 18 and above. Housing, unfortunately, affects the children, the most vulnerable people of society, so we have to see how important this is.
Yeah, I think what we're talking about is outcomes from housing. I mean, obviously not specifically housing alone, but if we're interested in exploring all the positive and negative when not done right outcomes from housing, then we should all consider that full spectrum of outcomes when we're commissioning projects.
I think it's building on your previous point, which is getting to know the community that you're working in. It's there's a great strength in a health-based approach, but sometimes there's a tendency to come up with these terrible figures of all the deficiencies and problems, and actually get to know people, because there will be strengths as well, and it's building on both the deficiencies, the needs in an area, and the strengths, to recognise that people are strong and that they are, have a huge amount to give, and I think if you can garner that, then that's a better approach. Can I have a quick plug?
Yeah.
We've got a project that's kicking off very shortly with 5 registered providers, housing associations, local authorities, funded by Fusion 21, to do just this, which is to talk to neighbourhoods in a neighbourhood context. And we've got 1 space left, so if there are any registered providers out there, then give me a shout afterwards.
Brilliant, brilliant. Can we go to the floor with questions before I thank everybody?
2 questions.
2, yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, maybe if we take 2 together, we can have one more, Jez.
Go on then, 2 together, go on, go for it. Yes, so 2 here, and then we'll go 1 there. Yeah. Shout out, I think, might be quicker.
Mike, Jeff, just quickly, there's an example of a modular temporary home outside, and I've just popped in and had a chat to the people in there. It was put up in 70 days, quite remarkable in there. If you haven't been in, please go in. Some of the comments of people going around have been really interesting. Why are the plugs put on the outside of the wall, and could the ceilings be lower? And I'm thinking there's a perfectly good solution there. You could just take it, and every local authority could have it as a temporary solution to alleviate housing. How much do you think we balance quality of homes with the actual need for homes, and how much should we do that, in your view?
We'll just take 2 questions.
For me.
Yeah, hold that one. And
I'm Mark Southgate, and I'm going to say I'm a planner, so I'm reflecting on the planning element, and it's a question around how we disconnected the why in planning. So it's all about process. Planning came from public health. Planning